Hi, this is Guy Wallace. I started in learning and development way back in 1979, and I semi-retired in 2023. But my current mission as a semi-retired L&D professional is to help enterprise learning and development organizations become more performance-based. Welcome to my podcast. This episode, the first of 2025, is about the comparative ease at measuring the transfer and impact of performance-based instruction compared to instruction, or the education and communication types of learning, that isn't focused and rooted or anchored in the performance requirements from back on the job. When you conduct evaluation or attempt to otherwise measure the transfer and impact of L&D, are you looking for direct evidence of L&D's transfer and impact, or are you looking for indirect evidence of such? There is a big difference. When you're doing performance-based instruction or training or learning, it's much easier to look for direct evidence, post-learning, to be compared with the pre-learning measures of quality, quantity, and costs of the performance, or in layman's terms, performing better, faster, and cheaper. For far too long, way too many L&D functions have not focused on the terminal performance of their learners, the performance requirements from back on the job, so they didn't begin with the end in mind. They began in the middle, on some knowledge or skills or behaviors or competencies that perhaps intuitively are expected or assumed to be required to enable performance back on the job. So what they've produced is content on knowledge or skills or behaviors or competencies that are not necessarily instructional, but are content on the assumed required knowledge, skills, behaviors, and or competencies in isolation from the performance that they would enable. That's always led to questions and sometimes arguments about what to keep and what to cut. It's really all kind of arbitrary when your effort isn't anchored on those performance requirements that reflect the authentic tasks and outputs and stakeholder requirements back there on the job. This need and the continued swing and miss of L&D and training and development before that name change is really nothing new. How to do performance-based instruction, and by instruction I mean both performance guides and learning experience, both of which were previously known by other names including job aids and training, which by the way were always human-centric after being performance-centric. L&D designers and developers really need to begin with the end in mind, which is the terminal performance and the desired outcomes that they would, should, could hope to enable. Terminal performance are the tasks performed, both the overt behavioral tasks that we can observe, count, and measure, plus the covert cognitive tasks, the thinking tasks that we cannot observe, count, or measure, but are needed nonetheless to be performed in the learner's heads before, during, and after the behavioral tasks. Those cognitive and behavioral tasks are what produces outputs, the products produced and delivered, or the services rendered. However you want to look at it, it's the results or deliverables, if you will, of task performance. When the tasks themselves meet stakeholder requirements, that can be a good thing as long as it leads to the outputs that meet the stakeholder requirements. Now, some stakeholders care about the tasks or the process, and they don't really care about the outputs. Other stakeholders care about the outputs and don't necessarily care about the tasks or the processes that were used. And other stakeholders care about both. Your internal clients should care about both. They want outputs produced that meet the stakeholder requirements that leads to a positive outcome. When their people, their performers, produce outputs that don't meet stakeholder requirements, that, of course, is a poor outcome. People are on the payroll to produce outputs by performing tasks that can or may not lead to a positive outcome ultimately, because there may be other variables that affect the outcome. I could produce a worthy video script that then's misused in the video production effort outside of my control and produce an instructional product that leads to a poor outcome. And it may be hard to dissect the data to determine what was at the root of that poor outcome. When we're not focused on performance, the tasks and the outputs and the stakeholder requirements, we are not doing instruction or training or learning that enables near transfer. We're producing content that requires far transfer, where we expect the learner to take our formal learning and then go into an informal learning mode where through trial and error learning or social learning, they might figure it out how to apply what they've learned eventually. That may be ultimately effective, but it sure isn't efficient. It begs the question, how much time have you got until the learner needs to become performance competent? Are you in a hurry? Is your client? And how will you measure it if it was far transfer on topics assumed to be related to the knowledge, skills, behaviors, or competencies that intuitively seem to be required by the performers back on the job? If you don't cover how to apply what was learned, nor give sufficient practice with feedback to really hone the use of that knowledge, skill, behavior, or competency that's required back on the job in the work processes, otherwise known as work streams or workflows, then it's likely not learned well enough to actually transfer, and with no transfer, impact is unlikely, and your ROI would be nil at best and more likely negative. And because you weren't focused on the performance back on the job to start with, you don't have the baseline measurements for quality, quantity, or cost to compare with the post-learning numbers. So you begin to look at all sorts of data, indirect data, to try to determine if we can claim that we had an impact. You cannot determine a cost-benefit for your learning and development efforts, including the cost it took the learners to participate in them and complete them, because you don't have good data. You don't have direct data. You might have indirect data, but it's going to look more like smoke and mirrors than actual measurements of the performance back on the job. It is just so much easier to measure the transfer and impact of learning when we know what the terminal performance looks like before we start and how it's measured before we start, because not knowing that is like throwing a dart in the dark at a dartboard that you cannot see. If you want to improve your ability to measure the effectiveness and efficiency of your learning and development products, begin with the end in mind. Don't start in the middle. There are many models and methods that can get you there. I have mine, but there are certainly dozens and dozens of others that might work for you. And don't forget, adopt what you can and adapt the rest, unless of course you need to reject some aspects of what works for others, as what works in some context for others may not work for you in your context. Good luck. I hope this has been helpful. Thank you.